So I think there's a couple myths out there in the coaching world that I'd like to challenge. The first one is this belief that if you played at a high level, you'll make a great coach. Now, say from my own personal experience, I played Division I basketball at the University of South Carolina for a year. And if I was really honest, when I got my start in coaching in Ireland, I used that, as credibility to land myself a lot of coaching jobs. But I promise you, I didn't have a clue what I was doing. In my own experience and in the experience I have had with working with and getting to know many coaches who were former high-level athletes, having success as an athlete is almost in many ways more of a challenge than it is helpful. The second belief I'd like to challenge out there in the coaching world today is that you can't be transformational in professional sports. That's just not true. And in fact, today's guest, Andre Pretorius, makes a strong argument that the challenges of being a successful athlete are almost greater than the advantages of having been a successful athlete when you transition into coaching. And he's an incredible example, though, also of how important and effective transformational coaching is at the highest levels. Now, Andre is a former professional rugby player who played 15 plus years professionally and most famously won the 2007 World Cup with the Springboks, which is the nickname for the South African international rugby team, for those that are not very familiar with international rugby. Now, currently he is the head coach of Northwest University Varsity Cup team in South Africa, as well as the Leopards Currie Cup team. He's also a longtime listener to the Coaching Culture podcast, through which we've been able to actually get connected and get to know each other through some periodic calls. Over the next 2 episodes, he'll be sharing his journey with us from player to coach and from transactional to transformational coach. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast, brought to you by TOC Culture Consulting. I'm JP Nerban, joined by my friend and co-host Nate Sanderson. If you'd like to get the notes to this and every episode of the Coaching Culture Podcast, as well as a bunch of other free practical tools, head on over to tocculture.com. Now, today's episode is over our typical 30 minutes or less. Reason being, I just couldn't find anything to cut out of our conversation. It was just that good. Nate and I were both taking pages and pages of notes as we were listening. Enough said. Let's just get to it. Well, Andre, we are excited to have you on the podcast today. This has been a long time coming, and I think we connected a little over a year and a half ago, and it's been a pleasure to get to know you. And kind of want to start our conversation off today with you reflecting on your experience as a player, and what is kind of like that one experience that you think has impacted you the most as a coach today? Like when you look back on your playing career, what experience still impacts you today as you coach?
JP, Nate, thank you. Firstly, thank you for having me on. Yeah, it's like it's quite the equivalent to a kid watching his favorite TV show and then getting to be on it. Huge fans of you too, and since I started listening to you, you guys have made a real impact in the teams that I've been in. So thank you for that. To get back to your question, unfortunately, it was very late in my career when I went to a new union, and there was a player which I'd like to name. His name was Adrian Jacobs. He played for the Springboks as well. We were playing at the Sharks at the time. And the one thing that Adrian taught me was you can't just be a great teammate when you're winning or when you're getting chosen or you're in the match day 15 or match day 23. If you had to look at AD Jacobs at a training session and you had no idea of what the team looks like, you would not be able to tell if he was injured, if he wasn't picked, he's on the bench or he's starting. He was always the same. And like I said, unfortunately, that happened very late in my career. And it was also a day or two past where I realized I don't think I was the best teammate at stages. That typical entitlement excuses. And I think if I'd realized that a bit earlier in my career, I think the career could have looked a bit different. Maybe not for me, but the people I played with.
I think it's pretty interesting that you share that. It's another player's example that you kind of had that transformation in your own playing career, right? To become more team centered and focused on the team, because I think, so much of us go through that experience as well as a coach, right? I think that's a lot of the coaches that listen to this podcast, as we go through some sort of transformation. You were the fly half in rugby for the majority of the teams I think you played for, which for our listeners that are not familiar with rugby, that's kind of like the quarterback of rugby, if I'm right. I'm not an expert in rugby either. So just as you saw that shift, that change in yourself as a player, to be more others focused, how did that affect your leadership on and off the pitch?
Uh, it definitely improved it, and it made me a lot more self-aware of how I was conducting myself within the team. I also, because I was in most teams that I played, I was the number one fly off and always selected. I think it was kind of easy to be a team man, but when the injuries started eating and a couple of coaches showing valid weaknesses that I had, and I wasn't agreeing, and like I said, making up excuses, I think that all changed, and I took on more of a mentorship role, and that, I think that made me realize that this is something that I'd love to do, and coaching was the one way that I could be doing it. And the players that I played with after that, they were obviously much younger than me, and I think I could add, if I didn't realize that with Eddie Jacobs' situation, I don't think I could have added the value to those young players, because I would have been more concerned with why am I not playing, why is things not going for me, and you kind of withdraw yourself instead of drowning yourself in trying to improve these guys and make it better for the future.
I'm curious a little bit about what you're describing here. It sounds kind of like the life cycle of an athlete. When you come in as a younger athlete and your hair is on fire and your body still works, and you're getting after it, and then over time, not only does your role on the team as a player change, but your role in the locker room changes as well. And I wonder now, as a coach, do you look at how you approach players and where they're at kind of in that life cycle or their career, and having the experience that you've had, does that affect how you coach players in different stages now?
Right, without a doubt. I think more so with the provincial team that I coach, because you've got certain guys that aren't full professional, they semi-professional, so some of them work in mines, so they get off, they get up at 2, go to work at 3, they go down at about quarter to 4, they come back out at 4, and they need to train at 5. So for that guy, he's got a family, he's got value to add, but you've got to understand where he's coming from during the day. So for me, firstly, it needs to be the best part of his day when he gets there, and secondly, definitely, again, if it wasn't for the situation and the realization that I had with that teammate of mine, I don't think I would have gone into coaching, for one, because I would never have seen the value I could add as a person, not just as a player. And secondly, I think it's important to realize that that life cycle that you're talking about, and you've gone through that yourself now, so you can put yourself in their shoes, and once you see that negativity, so I'm really aware of what's happening in my teams and the temperature that's there, and I pick up these things quite quickly, and I get to speak to the player either off the field, on the field, or whenever the situation or opportunity arises. So definitely that's made a big difference in just being aware of where these guys are and how to approach them.
I think that's an interesting perspective too, because so often we hear, there's kind of this belief that former players make the best coaches because of their knowledge of the game. But what you're kind of describing here is it's the empathy, it's the understanding of what an athlete goes through in the course of their career that really can make an athlete or become a really good coach.
Yeah, Nate, make no mistake. When I started coaching, I think I've told JP this. If I could phone every player that I coached in my first 2 years and apologize to them for some of the things that I did and said, I'd do that immediately. Luckily, some of them are still here, and I have had chats with them. But I think the problem with former players starting to coach is, well, not the problem. Firstly, you start off with some credibility because of the profile that you have, and which is nice because you get their attention. And then as you start coaching, that it's like that the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people with low ability overestimate what they can do, and people with high ability underestimate what they can do. So you start doubting yourself, and when you start doubting yourself, you want to justify to these guys how much you know, and that just leads you down the wrong path. You know, you instead of teaching them and trying to convey the knowledge, you try and show them how much you know because you want to justify how much you know. You become unnecessarily tough because you want to instill a discipline. So that whole player-centered, that relationship-based, that thing flies out the window because it becomes a me thing again. And that's sometimes the problem. And also as a former player, and luckily this was not the case with me because I was always looking for innovative ways to play, and it's the same with the coaching. But sometimes former players, because they've played at a certain level, they might be in a bit of a comfort zone when it comes to the knowledge, and they stop learning. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes they can make.
I think that's a really profound insight. And I'd like to unpack a little bit before we go even deeper down your coaching journey. I want to take a step back to your player journey. And you mentioned you had a high profile, lots of accomplishments, obviously one of the bigger ones being the 2007 World Cup with South Africa. I'm just curious, on this journey, the higher you go, the more success you have, the easier it is to tie that success, that achievement, your identity, mesh those together. As you become the sport, you become the World Cup. Oh, that you're Andre who won a World Cup for the Springboks, right? Like everybody sees that, and it can be kind of dangerous, and we've talked about that from the mental health of athletes, as well as just like you even mentioned there, for us to kind of be stuck in our ways and self-focused as athletes. So I'm just kind of curious what your experience was with that, managing that high profile athlete status.
JP, when things are going well, it's nice to wrap yourself into that identity. It's when you get that inevitable patch of poor form, or you've got a run of injuries, and if your identity is wrapped up in your performances, you're not going to have a very high reward for yourself. And so I think that's something that I learned very quickly from my late father. The first time I got written up in the newspapers where I was still at school, and I was having a great season, and every Monday morning he'd get the paper and we'd have a read. And then when I started playing provincial and professional, obviously the teams you play against and the quality of players increase, they get better. So consistency wise, you start to lack a bit, and then the same people that wrote you up are the same people that's writing you off. And I think my dad could see the way that it was affecting me, because I still want to read it, but I didn't want to read it. So he taught me at a very, very young age, listen, you got to leave that. And I think we were lucky. We didn't have social media. I think some of the guys today would also not like to read everything about them, but it's on your phone the second you walk off the field, good or bad. So I got really lucky with my dad as a mentor there where he taught me the newspapers aren't for you. Just stay in your lane, focus on what you need to do, and that made quite a difference for me. But I've seen players with so much potential go down that path where their identity was wrapped in it, and they never fulfilled that potential.
I'd like for you to kind of unpack that, if you don't mind, a little bit more about your father's role in that. Like how did he? Because I think this is the challenge for. Your father was a mentor. So sometimes as coaches, we're mentors to our players, and we have many coaches on here. I mean, everyone has that player that's just the high profile player. And your father was that mentor to you. And I'm just curious, what were those conversations like? How did he help you to bring that awareness, to that trap?
I think it all started two things that I remember from my dad was, the first one's loyalty, and the second one was humility, being humble. And for him, the one thing that he never wanted was for me to become arrogant, big-headed, so self-assured that it's to my own detriment. So he was very intentional with the way he handled that after games when we were at friends or at the team, and one of the dads would tell me how good I played. My dad would say, "Don't say it in front of him." You can say that to me. Don't say it in front of him. He was really, it was he had a bit of I wouldn't say a phobia, but that he was really intentional with managing the information that I got from other people to ensure that I stay with my feet on the ground.
Well, I'm curious about this. So you mentioned you're thankful for not growing up or not having your playing days in the social media world, but obviously that's a place where your players find themselves today. And as coaches, we're facing the same thing, right? We come home from a game and there's the newspaper article, or there's the coaches from the stands that are telling us what we should have done or shouldn't have done. And how do you try to lead, in this environment? And maybe not having experienced it might make it even more difficult. I mean, I'm an old man too. I didn't grow up, with social media and cell phones and things like that. So I find it sometimes hard to know what the right guidance is to give, to our athletes today. How do you approach that with your guys?
Nate, it is difficult because it's so in your face. It's something that you can't avoid sometimes. So I think rather than trying to avoid it, which is difficult, like I said, managing and handling it is probably the better way. And if there's one circle in your life that can teach you that, I think it is with the rugby team. And for me, it starts on the training field. I played for certain coaches that if you had a good game or a good training, you're a good person. But if that swaps around, you're also a bad person when you're not having a good training or you're not having a good. So I learned a lot from that. So in training, you are going to have accepted, you are going to have bad trainings. But that doesn't make you a bad son or a bad father or a bad brother. You just had a bad training. Find out the cause of it and let's fix it. So I think the way we handle each other within the team, that's one part of their life where they get to know that it doesn't matter what people write or say about me. This coaching staff believes in me, and when I go to training, I will make mistakes, and it won't be ticked against my character, but rather against a focus point or a concentration lapse or something like that.
I think one conversation that we've tried to have with our players too is, before even getting into the season and the competitions and that sort of thing, is just getting them to reflect on whose voice really matters and why.
Yeah.
Whether it's your coaches and your teammates, obviously, or the people that are closest to you that have been supporters for your whole life, but really, why do those voices matter? And ultimately we want them to land on the place of, we really want to honor the voices that help us grow as people and as players, and if that isn't the end, to the other voices that we're hearing, that provides a bit of a filter to, it's not always easy to drown it out, but at least it does give them something to be able to differentiate whose voice matters.
Yeah, I like that. I've just written that down, just so you know. Another thing we try and do, and something I was battling at first, is to have the approach of understand and assist. So when players are late, we don't have a code of conduct. We've got a dissect role, and we try and not be policemen within the team. Life happens. Your alarm clock may not go off at the right time. You might get a flat tire. The communication from them is just really important. But also, if a player is telling you a story, instead of doubting this, is he taking a chance? We give him the benefit of the doubt immediately, and take the approach of, you understand and assist. You've been late 3 times this week. Are you battling with transport? Are you having problems at home? How can we help? And obviously, if it keeps on going, if it's a consistent thing and there's a trend building up, maybe the jersey is just not that important to you.
I absolutely love that. I just wrote that one down. Understand and assist. Nate and I were just talking about that yesterday. So I appreciate you sharing that. That is incredible stuff. But you're also kind of reflecting as you've been talking here about some of your experiences with other coaches. And you've had some phenomenal coaches. I even got to read a little bit about you in Eddie Jones's book, My Life in Rugby, which is one of my favorite coaching books, and a very well-regarded coach internationally. So I'm just curious, reflecting on some of the coaches that you played for, is there a specific coach or experience that, is still carrying with you and is still impacting you in the way that you coach today?
Geez, Nate, JP, Nate, you said you're an old man. I read the other day that I counted the coaches I played for. It's over 40. So I think my career just might have been a couple of years too long. I think the one that stands out the most is the coach that gave me an opportunity to play provincial and then professional, and it's Coach Eugene Eloff. He's actually got a sports mentorship company as well. He's not coaching anymore, but he's coaching the coaches at the moment. And I think why he's so special is not for the fact that he was the one that gave me the opportunity to play provincial and then professional. It's the relationship he had with his players, which was very special. And when my dad passed away, he kind of took on that role, without me asking. We got really, really close. I was at one stage mentally, I wasn't at a great place, and he put things in place. I went to go and see a couple of people and a whole support group and staff, just for me, just to get through that. So, and like I said, the way he built his relationship with his players was phenomenal. So that's something that I've taken out of his book.
Yeah, and what I know of you in our relationship, I can tell that you're striving to be that for your players as you grow as a coach. And I guess that's where I'd like to move our conversation over to that a little bit now. You've kind of mentioned the challenges already, but I want to kind of go a little bit deeper into those challenges of being a high profile player, successful player, or just even general, just being a player and moving from player to coach. I think it's not an easy thing. I think the outside perception is still mistaken. Like, oh, he played at a high level, he must be able to coach. And this is across all sports. So, talk to us a little about those challenges of moving from player to coach.
With, like I said earlier, it's one of the things was, trying to justify how good you were as a player by trying to show them how much you know. So, really getting into the teaching and getting the message across. And it's not how you teach, it's more about how they learn. And I think that's a really big, you have to kind of adapt to every single. Nate mentioned at the beginning, every team's got their own flavor. Some teams have got a lot of leaders, and the teaching is a bit easier because on field, you're not coaching as much. They're doing the work for you. Other teams you get like we have now. We have a young team with so much enthusiasm and a hunger to learn that they take in everything, that you actually have to kind of tone it down a bit because they're trying to do everything at once on the field. So I think the adapting to every single group and knowing how to teach them because of the way they learn, that's been for me. Firstly, you need to realize that, and I think that took me a while to realize, and then now to put the systems and structures in place to adapt to that. That's been quite a struggle, but I think we're heading in the right direction with regards to that.
You mentioned before that if you could go back and talk to the players that were on your first couple of teams, you'd have some things to apologize for. And I'm just curious, we all come from different backgrounds when we take our first head coaching position. What were some of your blind spots, even after your long playing career that maybe you weren't quite prepared for when you started coaching?
Well, Nate, I can promise you there was no understand and assist, and there was no benefit of the doubt for the player. So, if a player was late, and to me, the jersey immediately didn't mean enough to him. And when players were trying to justify certain things in the game, I was seeing that as excuses. Now, you can imagine if a coach takes that approach, what the feedback will be on that. It's not going to be constructive. It's not going to help the player. And the player is definitely not going to come to you with any of his problems, especially not his personal problem. So that to me was some of the things that I really looked back and said, listen, I could have done better there. And also I think I concentrated on the game way too much than I did on my players. I was always trying to build relationships with players, but I think the game kind of took over that relationship. So when we lose, you go into a certain form of, it was because he was late. It was, you were looking for that type of thing instead of, like I said, understand and assist and looking to get the team to have a better culture. I was getting the team to play better rugby.
So you've made this change, or you're starting to make this change. Like, what was the point though for you that helped you have this awareness of the blind spots that you've kind of shared with us?
JB, I think when I started, you build relationships. You're just starting out coaching, you're enjoying it. There's enthusiasm. First season didn't go too badly. You build up relationships with players. You coach the same players the next year, and things don't go as well. And by the middle of that year, I realized that I'd ruined some of those relationships with the way I coached. I always wanted to show the players that I treat all the players the same, and there's no one stands out and that type of thing. And for me, when I saw in that second year, halfway through the year, I'd ruined some of the relationships I built up. I knew I had to change something. At first, I didn't know what, but I knew something had to change, and I also knew it wasn't on field.
I really appreciate your vulnerability. It may feel like a little bit like confession here, as you're coming in here and kind of burying all some of the tougher times of your coaching. But you've mentioned that some of your players are still around. I'm curious, as you've gone on this journey, you started this awareness, you start to make changes. What the response has been to that. I think a lot of times, coaches do try to make some of these changes to be a little bit more transformational, a little less yelling and screaming, getting on their guys. And the some response of some players is like, "Well, I need that." It's not every player feels like that doesn't work for them. So I'm just kind of curious the response of the players that have been around, maybe the older, first couple of years, Andre, to now.
I think it comes back to that word you just said, vulnerability. I couldn't phone everybody and apologize to them, but the guys that stuck around and are still in the system and playing for me, I had the opportunity to be really intentional with going to have a coffee with a lot of them, and just explaining what happened. It's one of those things where you learn. You don't know what you don't know. You think you're doing the best, and it wasn't. And I think what that really made them see that it's this is just another person trying to coach but doing his best, made a mistake, and that's not his personality, because it wasn't. And that is especially that coach Lofi Elof. I was lucky enough that he could intervene and say, listen, that's not the way you were in your teams. That's not the way you want to coach. You're trying to justify yourself now. And again, luckily that happened. So I could go and try and make this change. And when I spoke to the players, the response was great. It was really, and till today, some of them are, yeah, it's much different to that second year.
Well, I'm curious now, as you kind of reflect and you look back, we've got so many coaches that listen to this podcast that are, motivated to try to use their sport to try to impact people. And you mentioned, the importance of relationships and how that kind of relationship game, so to speak, has changed for you over the course of your career. If you were sitting in front of a group of coaches right now, and they said, what are some of the keys? What are some of the best ways to build healthy relationships with our players? Because I do think coaches struggle with that, whether it's because so much emphasis they put on the game or whatever, how they were coached. What would you say? What were some key factors to building relationships with players for you today?
I think, mate, it's for me, and obviously with my experience up to now, there's certain things that I don't want to do again. So being authentic, but being consistent, having consistent authenticism. So you can't be a father figure for him one day and the next day your whole demeanor with him changes. I think if he's familiar with the personality that he's working with, the wall breaks down and you get to work with the mind, the heart, and the rugby player. And for me, it's the consistency of how you treat the players, and then also I think the intentionality with which you try and dig deeper into what's happening within the life of that player. You're not going to get it with every single player. Some of the players are just closed books, and it's normally some of the really resilient players. They do really well at studying. That things are going well for them. But if you are consistent, the day that they do need you, you might be just the one that they open up to.
I want to follow up on one more thing that you mentioned here before. You said that earlier in your career, you focused way too much on the game. And I don't know if that makes sense to all the coaches. And I don't even know if that necessarily makes sense to me, because that's how we're evaluated as coaches, right? Is our success or failure in the game. So how do you put the game in proper perspective when that's the job?
Yeah, it's difficult to say it without using the cliche of being really process driven. But I really try and take the result out of any week's preparation. We try and get small victories within the processes. We look to set goals, see how we're going to get them within the game, and those are the things that we focus on. I think this year I only mentioned winning once, and I tried. It was halftime in one of the tough games, and I said, "Listen, good teams find a way to win." And as soon as I said it, I tried to back up. You could actually hear the truck back up, try and back up, but I couldn't get out of it. The team actually said to me afterwards, "But you mentioned winning," and I said, "I apologize. I just felt we were better on the day, and we hadn't done what we planned, so we needed to find a way to get the stuff done." So to put the game, it's still something that I really love doing. Technical, tactical, strategic. It's something that I really enjoy doing. But if you're going to have unhappy players, players that don't trust the coaching staff, trust the integrity of how much care there is within the system, you can plan as much technical and tactical. You probably will never reach it.
Well, what I love about your story is, you're in a high pressure environment. The expectation to win is there every day. You also have, like you mentioned earlier, you had this great career as an athlete. So there's obviously that pressure to, okay, now I got to go be a great rugby coach. And there's all these pressures, but yet you haven't let that be an excuse. You haven't let that be an excuse at all. In fact, you've been really intentional, and you've been making these changes in your coaching, and you're continuing to invest in that. So I'm just kind of curious, because everybody has this vision, obviously, listens here to be more transformational, impact lives and all that. But we have default ways of doing things. And some of us are a little bit more cemented or locked into those because we've had years and years of coaching this way. And maybe you caught yourself early, but I'm just kind of curious, how have you been intentional in your own development and growth as a coach? Like, what's that process? What are the things that you have done that have helped you to make those changes in yourself?
JP, I don't want to sound like a copy and paste coach, but like I said earlier, you don't know what you don't know. And I think 99.9% of coaches are doing the best that they think is right. So if you don't go and look for examples of what you think is right, or stumble onto something that you think can make you a better coach, you might just stay on the same track for too long. And so what I've done is I've really tried to research successful coaches, and Popovich is one of the guys that I came across, and he's a total relationship builder. He connects with his players on so many different levels. And although I wouldn't use his methods, but I could see what his intent were. I could see what he's trying to do. I could see where he was going with it and why he was going with it. And so that's something that I really tried to focus on, is to try and find out what I don't know. And again, Nate, it wasn't rugby things that I was looking for. I was looking for, how do I improve the culture of the team? How do I eliminate entitlement? So, how do you eliminate entitlement within the team? We've got certain team selection criteria that we have to adhere to, and which makes it really difficult to tell a person that he's not playing, but it's not due to him not being good enough. It's due to competition rules that we can't select him. So I've really tried to be intentional with trying to find out what I don't know, but not necessarily the X's and O's, more the off-field stuff and that type of thing.
And I just want to say I'm just so impressed by it, because I think the higher up you go in coaching, I think the more I see coaches silo themselves, and, they don't go explore, other sports as much. They don't look outside their own little circle. And here you are reading about an NBA coach in America. You're listening to our podcast, and of just, some guys in the States, that, is nothing about rugby, and I think we've had maybe one other rugby coach on here in our 200 something episodes. And so it just shows your character and your growth mindset that, you're just looking for the better way. And so I appreciate that big time. I think there's the learning, there's gathering new information. So my follow-up is, as you get and learn these new ways of doing things, as you study these coaches, how do you take that then and then kind of implement it into your coaching? Because I think there's so much information out there if we want it. How do you decide, hey, this is what I'm going to use to make myself a better coach?
Yeah, it's I think if you stumble across something, like you said with pass the bucket, sometimes it's not just something that you can implement immediately. You need to go and find what will resonate with the team, and need to adapt something and tweak a couple of things before you actually implement. So then, that to me is the fun part. Getting some of the information is more difficult, but then implementing it into your team, into working with the players that you've been intentional with getting to know, and to see this little seed grow, that you saw something that could work with it for your team's culture, and to see it grow into something where, guys after seasons telling me that he's never felt so included in the team than this year or last year or whenever. So that to me is quite rewarding. One of the things I stumbled across for the entitlement dilemma that I was sitting with was your episode number 134, where everything feels like family, but not everybody gets to eat. And after using that, I think a lot of players understood what the system was about and what we're trying to achieve in the team. So thank you for that.
All right, that's it for today. Lots of notes on this episode, so head on over to tocculture.com and subscribe to our weekly newsletter to get those notes. Next week, we'll be back for the second part of our conversation, where he is going to go into some very practical ways in which he builds his team's culture. You're not going to want to miss it, so be sure, if you haven't already, to subscribe to the Coaching Culture Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts.